Sometimes the most precious things in life come wrapped in the most ordinary moments. When Ben Carter, a struggling widowed carpenter, finds a millionaire's injured son outside his workshop on a stormy afternoon, he has no idea this single act of kindness will change everything. Ben has been raising his 6-year-old daughter Lily alone since his wife's passing, working with calloused hands to keep food on their table and a roof over their heads. Clara Rivera has built a tech empire from nothing, but wealth hasn't filled. The emptiness left by years of guarding her heart and protecting her 12-year-old son, Marco, from a world that sees only dollar signs. When Marco's cycling accident leaves him with a broken leg and Clara stranded in Ben's small town, two worlds collide. Over weeks of recovery, Clara discovers something money can't buy: the gentle strength of a man who reads bedtime stories with the same care he measures wood, who stretches meager suppers to feed extra mouths without complaint. As the families slowly heal together, Clara finds herself torn between the security of her controlled world and the messy, beautiful reality of love she never thought she deserved. But when her corporate obligations threaten to pull her back to the city, will she choose the safe distance of wealth or risk everything for a carpenter's open heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the dust motes dancing in Ben Carter's workshop, casting golden streaks across the scarred wooden workbench that had belonged to his father and his father before him. The scent of sawdust and linseed oil hung in the air like incense, familiar and comforting as an old hymn. Ben ran his weathered hand along the smooth surface of a cedar plank, feeling for imperfections that his trained fingers could detect better than his eyes at 34. Ben carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned life's hardest lessons early. His brown hair, touched with premature silver at the temples, caught the light as he bent over his work. The laugh lines around his hazel eyes spoke of better times, though they had deepened with grief in the 3 years since Sarah's passing. His hands, strong and capable, bore the honest calluses of a craftsman who shaped wood into beauty with nothing more than skill, patience, and love. The workshop itself told the story of 3 generations of Carter men. Hand tools hung in precise order on pegboard walls, each one worn smooth by decades of use. A collection of wooden planes, their handles polished to a warm glow, sat ready on the bench. The old cast-iron vise his grandfather had installed still held fast, though its surface bore the gentle patina of age. In the corner, a rocking chair waited for its final sanding, a commission from Mrs. Henderson, whose arthritis made her old chair too uncomfortable for the long evenings she spent reading to her grandchildren. "Daddy, the pancakes are ready." Lily's voice carried across the yard from their small white house, bright as the morning itself. At 6 years old, she possessed her mother's gentle spirit and her father's determined chin. Her auburn hair, the exact shade of autumn leaves, caught the sunlight as she bounded down the porch steps, still in her pajamas decorated with dancing unicorns. Ben smiled, setting down his sandpaper. "Coming, little bird." The nickname had been Sarah's first, whispered over the bassinet during those precious early weeks, when wonder at their daughter's existence still felt like a miracle they might wake up from. Now it carried the weight of memory, but also the promise of continuity. The love that had created this child lived on in every shared moment. Their house, modest but well-maintained, sat on a quarter-acre lot at the edge of Willow Creek, population 2,847, according to the faded sign at the town limits. The morning glory vines Sarah had planted still climbed the front porch trellis, their purple blooms opening to greet each new day. Ben had learned to tend them, along with the vegetable garden and the herb patch by the kitchen window. These small rituals of care had become his way of honoring her memory while building a life that could hold both grief and joy got inside. The kitchen held the warm chaos of a Saturday morning. Lily had indeed made pancakes, or rather, she had poured the batter Ben had mixed the night before into the skillet, creating wonderfully lopsided circles that bore little resemblance to the perfect rounds in the cookbook illustrations. Maple syrup, a gift from old Tom Mitchell, whose sugar maples lined the creek, cooled golden on their plates. I made them extra special, Lily announced, climbing onto her chair with the serious dignity of a chef presenting her masterpiece. I added chocolate chips, just like Mama used to. Ben's throat tightened for just a moment. These casual mentions of Sarah still caught him off guard, though he'd learned not to flinch away from them. Lily's memories of her mother were precious things to be treasured and protected. They're beautiful, sweetheart. Mama would be proud. As they ate, Lily chattered about her plans for the day, helping Mrs. Chun with her flower garden, playing with the Henderson children, maybe catching fireflies if the evening stayed warm. Her world was small but secure, bounded by familiar faces and trusted routines. Ben had worked hard to maintain that security, even as his own world had seemed to crumble around him. The phone rang as they finished breakfast. Ben Carter, he answered, his voice carrying the patient warmth that had made him the unofficial go-to person for anyone in Willow Creek who needed help. Ben, it's Margaret Chun. I hate to bother you on a Saturday, but my Tom took a tumble in the garden. Nothing serious, mind you, but he's scraped up his arm pretty good, and you know how he is about doctors. Ben glanced at Lily, who was already reaching for the small medical kit he kept on the kitchen counter. In a town an hour from the nearest hospital, Ben's first aid training had made him an unofficial community medic. He'd learned the skills during his brief stint in the National Guard, before Sarah's pregnancy had brought him home to take over his father's carpentry business. What had started as basic military training had expanded over the years through online courses and practical experience. People trusted him to handle the small emergencies that dotted rural life cuts, sprains, the occasional minor break that needed stabilizing until proper medical help could be reached. We'll be right over, Mrs. Chun. Tell Tom to sit still and keep pressure on that scrape. 20 minutes later, Ben knelt beside Tom Chun in the couple's meticulously maintained garden, cleaning and bandaging a gash on the older man's forearm. The wound was clean but deep, requiring careful attention to prevent infection. Lily sat nearby, handing Ben supplies from his kit with the solemn efficiency of a practiced nurse. You've got a gift for this, Margaret Chun observed, watching Ben's gentle hands work. Ever think about going back to school? Becoming a real paramedic or nurse? Ben smiled, taping the edges of the bandage with precise care. This suits me fine, Mrs. Chun. Besides, someone needs to keep the Hendersons' porch from falling down, and old furniture doesn't fix itself. It was a deflection, gentle but final. The truth was more complicated. Medical school required money Ben didn't have and time he couldn't spare. Lily needed stability, and Willow Creek needed its carpenter. These were facts he'd made peace with, even if sometimes, in the quiet hours after Lily went to bed, he wondered what other paths his life might have taken. The afternoon brought its own rhythms. Back in the workshop, Ben lost himself in the meditative process of wood shaping. The rocking chair for Mrs. Henderson was nearly complete, its curves flowing like water frozen in motion. Each piece he crafted carried something of his heart, not just skill, but intention. He wanted his work to last, to bring comfort and beauty to the lives it touched long after his own hands had stilled. Lily played nearby, building elaborate cities with wood scraps and telling stories to her collection of stuffed animals. She had inherited her parents' creativity, though hers expressed itself in grand narratives involving brave princesses, talking animals, and adventures that always ended in everyone finding their way home. Daddy, are we poor? The question came out of nowhere, as children's most important questions often do. Ben's hand stilled on the sandpaper. Why do you ask, little bird? Jenny Henderson says we are. She says that's why we don't have a big house like some people, and why you fix things instead of buying new ones. Ben set down his tools and crouched to Lily's level, taking her small hands in his larger ones. What do you think, sweetheart? Do you feel poor? Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to all philosophical questions. I don't think so. We have enough food, and our house is cozy, and you tell the best stories. But maybe we're different poor? Different how? Maybe we're poor in money, but rich in other stuff. Like, we have lots of love, and you can fix anything. And Mrs. Chun always gives us vegetables from her garden, because she says we help her more than she helps us. Ben felt his heart expand with pride and pain in equal measure. At 6, his daughter had grasped something that eluded many adults, that wealth came in forms that couldn't be counted in bank statements. That's exactly right, little bird. We're rich in all the ways that matter most. As evening approached, they walked hand in hand to the general store for groceries, a weekly ritual that served as much social function as practical need. The store, run by the Kowalski family for 3 generations, was the informal heart of Willow Creek. Here, over selections of canned goods and conversations about weather and crops, the community wove itself together week by week. Ben, good to see you, called Joe Kowalski from behind the counter. How's that rocking chair coming along? Margaret Henderson's been asking about it every day this week. Should be finished by Tuesday, Ben replied, selecting items with the careful attention of someone who counts every dollar. Tell her the finish needs another day to cure properly. As they shopped, Ben nodded to familiar faces, exchanged brief pleasantries, and received the casual gifts that marked him as valued community member. A few extra apples from the produce section, a discount on Lily's favorite cereal, the understanding that his credit was good if money ran short before the next commission the piece sold. This was his world, small, interconnected, built on relationships that stretched back generations. He knew every family's story, every child's name, every elder's favorite joke. It was a good life, he told himself, even if it sometimes felt constrained by circumstances beyond his control. That evening, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Ben tucked Lily into bed with their usual ritual. 3 stories, one from a book, one made up on the spot, and one about Mama watching over them from heaven. The last story was the hardest, but also the most necessary. Lily needed to carry Sarah's love forward, and Ben needed to believe that love transcended death. Sleep tight, little bird, he whispered, kissing her forehead. Tomorrow's a new day. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the windows. Ben made his rounds, checking that tools were covered, that windows were secure, that his small world was battened down against whatever storms might come. He couldn't know. As he settled into his chair with a cup of coffee and a woodworking magazine, that tomorrow would bring a storm that would change everything, not just the weather, but the careful boundaries of the life he'd built from the ashes of loss. Some storms, he would learn, didn't just pass over. Some storms brought unexpected gifts wrapped in chaos and pain. Gifts that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, worthiness, and the possibility of second chances. The rain began in earnest as Ben turned the pages, planning his next project, thinking about grocery money and Lily's growing feet that would soon need new shoes. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley like a promise, and the night settled around Willow Creek with the weight of anticipation. The storm arrived with Sunday afternoon's fury, transforming Willow Creek's peaceful streets into rivers of mud and fallen leaves. Ben stood at his workshop window, watching the rain slash across the glass in sheets, so thick the house barely 50 yards away seemed like a ghost ship in fog. The wind howled through the eaves, rattling the old building's bones and making him grateful for the solid construction his grandfather had insisted upon decades ago. Lily was safe inside the house, building elaborate pillow forts while at Disney. movie played on their small television. Ben had promised hot chocolate and grilled cheese sandwiches once the storm passed. But for now, he used the forced indoor time to organize his tools and plan the week's projects. The Henderson rocking chair sat finished in the corner, its golden finish gleaming despite the gray light filtering through the windows. The first sound was wrong. Not the organic crash of a falling branch or the metallic clatter of loose guttering, but something harder, more final. Ben looked up from the plane he'd been sharpening, his hands stilling on the blade. Then came the cry, high and sharp with pain, cutting through the storm's howl like a knife through canvas. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, grabbing his first aid kit from its shelf and throwing open the workshop door. The rain hit him like a cold slap, soaking through his flannel shirt in seconds. Through the curtain of water, he could make out shapes on the road bicycle, its front wheel twisted at an impossible angle, and two figures huddled beside it. "Help! Please, someone help us!" The woman's voice carried desperation that transcended the storm's noise. Ben jogged toward them, his boots squelching in the sudden mud, already running through possible injuries and treatments in his mind. The boy was maybe 12, his face pale with shock and pain, one leg bent at an angle that made Ben's stomach clench. The woman crouched beside him, her designer jacket already ruined by mud and rain, her dark hair plastered to her skull. But her eyes, intelligent, fierce, scared, were entirely focused on the child. "I'm Ben Carter," he called out as he approached, dropping to his knees beside them, without regard for the mud soaking through his jeans. "I have medical training. What happened?" "We were cycling," the woman said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "A tree branch came down right in front of us. Marco swerved and hit the pothole. I think his leg is broken." Ben was already examining the boy Marco with gentle, competent hands. The break was obvious, a clean fracture of the tibia about halfway down. Painful, but not life-threatening if properly stabilized. Marco's eyes were alert, pupils equal and reactive. "Good. Signs? Marco, I'm Ben. I'm going to take care of you, okay?" Ben's voice carried the calm authority that had seen him through countless emergencies. "Your leg is broken, but it's a clean break. We're going to get you fixed up." "It hurts," Marco whispered, tears mixing with rain on his cheeks. "I know it does, son, but you're being very brave. What's your mom's name?" "Clara," the woman answered for herself, studying Ben with eyes that seemed to catalog and assess everything about him in seconds. "Clara Rivera. We were just riding through town." Ben nodded, already working. From his kit, he pulled the emergency splint materials he'd learned to carry after. Tom Henderson's son had broken his ankle in a similar accident 2 summers ago. "Clara, I need you to help me. Can you do that?" She nodded, her fear transforming into focused determination. Ben appreciated that panic helped no one, but directed action could save lives. "Marco, this is going to hurt for just a moment while I stabilize your leg, but then it'll feel much better. I need you to be very still for me." Ben's hands moved with practiced efficiency, aligning the bone and securing the temporary splint with the smooth motions of someone who'd done this before. Marco cried out once, a sharp sound that cut through. His mother's composure like a blade, but then the worst was over. The splint held the leg stable, and the immediate agony gave way to a duller, more manageable pain. "The nearest hospital is an hour away," Ben said, looking at Clara. "In this storm, on these roads, maybe longer. I can make him comfortable and monitor him, but someone needs to drive very carefully. Or," he paused, weighing options. "My house is right there. You could bring him inside, keep him warm and dry while we wait for the storm to pass or call an ambulance." Clara's eyes darted between her injured son and this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere like an answer to prayer. Ben could see the calculation happening behind her gaze, trust versus caution, necessity versus control. She was clearly not someone accustomed to depending on others. But the rain was getting harder, and Marco was beginning to shiver despite the June warmth. Yes, she decided. Yes, thank you. Between them, they managed to lift Marco carefully, Ben supporting the injured leg, while Clara held her son's upper body. The boy was brave, biting back cries of pain as they moved him slowly toward the house. By the time they reached the porch, all three were soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "Lily," Ben called as they entered. "I need you to help me, sweetheart." His daughter appeared from her pillow fort kingdom, her eyes wide at the sight of strangers in their home. But she'd seen Ben handle emergencies before, and she moved with the competence of a child who'd learned that helping others was simply what people did. "Get the good blankets from the linen closet," Ben instructed as they settled Marco on the living room couch. "And fill the kettle for hot tea." Clara hovered nearby, her expensive clothes dripping onto Ben's worn hardwood floors, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she could hold in her fear through sheer will. Ben worked quickly, checking Marco's pulse and breathing, adjusting the splint, making sure no complications were developing. "He's stable," Ben announced after several minutes of careful examination. "The bone is well aligned. Circulation is good. He'll be sore, but he's going to be fine." Clara's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it seemed to knock the strength out of her. She sat heavily in Ben's armchair, suddenly looking smaller, more human than the competent executive she'd seen moments before. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. I don't know what we would have done if—" "No need for thanks," Ben replied gently. "This is what neighbors do." But even as he said it, Ben was acutely aware that these weren't neighbors in any conventional sense. Clara's accent carried the polish of private schools and boardrooms. Her mud-stained jacket bore a designer label that probably cost more than Ben made in a month. Even her son's cycling gear was clearly expensive, professional-grade equipment that spoke of serious recreational investment. They were refugees from a different world, stranded in his modest living room by circumstance and weather, and Ben found himself wondering what had brought them to Willow Creek in the first place. "The storm's getting worse," Clara observed, looking out the window where lightning now strobed through the gray afternoon. "I should call for help, get Marco to a proper hospital." "Your phone might not get signal out here in this weather," Ben said. "Mine's been cutting in and out all day. But honestly, moving him in this storm would be more dangerous than waiting it out. He's stable, comfortable. Sometimes the best medicine is just patience." Clara looked at her son, who had drifted into the light doze that often followed trauma and pain medication. Lily had covered him with their best quilt, the one Sarah's mother had made, and was quietly arranging her stuffed animals nearby, as if posting tiny guardians around the injured boy. We don't usually," Clara started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that usually came easily to her. "We're not used to accepting help from strangers." "Then it's good you're not dealing with a stranger," Ben replied with a slight smile. "You're dealing with neighbors you just haven't met yet." The storm raged outside, but inside Ben's small house, a different kind of weather was settling the awkward, tentative atmosphere of people thrown together by circumstances beyond their control, trying to find their footing in an unexpected situation that would change all their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The first awkward morning arrived with uncomfortable sunshine, as if nature itself was embarrassed by the chaos it had wrought the previous day. Ben woke on the living room floor, where he'd spent the night on a makeshift bed of couch cushions, keeping watch over Marco, whose pain had spiked during the small hours. Clara had taken Lily's room, while his daughter bunked with him, an arrangement that left everyone slightly displaced and uncertain. The house felt smaller with 4 people instead of 2, the familiar rhythms disrupted by the presence of strangers, who were trying very hard not to be burdens. Clara emerged from Lily's room, wearing one of Ben's flannel shirts over her expensive jeans. her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the controlled woman who had first demanded help in the storm. "How is he?" she asked quietly, crouching beside the couch where Marco lay propped on pillows, his injured leg elevated according to Ben's careful instructions. "Pain's manageable," Ben replied, checking the boy's pulse with gentle fingers. "Swelling's about what I'd expect. No signs of complications. He's healing exactly like he should." Marco stirred at their voices, his eyes fluttering open with the confused disorientation of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. "Mom? I'm here, sweetheart." Clara smoothed his hair back from his forehead, a gesture so tender it made Ben look away, remembering Sarah's hands performing the same comfort with Lily during childhood illnesses. "Is this still the nice man's house?" Marco asked, his voice thick with sleep and residual pain medication. "Yes, this is Mr. Carter's house. Ben's house, remember? He helped you yesterday." Marco's gaze found Ben, studying him with the frank curiosity of childhood. "You fixed my leg." "I helped stabilize it," Ben corrected gently. "Your body is doing the real fixing. I just made sure the bones stayed where they belong while nature does its work." From the kitchen came the sounds of Lily attempting to make breakfast, the clatter of dishes, and the opening and closing of cabinet doors, accompanied by her cheerful humming. She had adapted to their guests with the resilience of childhood, treating the disruption as an adventure rather than an inconvenience. "I should help her," Clara said, standing with obvious reluctance to leave Marco's side. "She's got it handled," Ben assured her. "Lily's been managing our morning routine for longer than most kids her age. Independent little thing." But Clara was already moving toward the kitchen, drawn by what sounded like the precarious stacking of plates. Ben heard quiet conversation, Lily's bright voice mixing with Clara's more measured tones, and then the soft sound of adult hands taking over tasks that were perhaps too ambitious for 6-year-old coordination. The dynamic felt strange, domestic, in a way that made Ben's chest tighten with memories and possibilities he wasn't ready to examine. He focused instead on Marco, checking the splint alignment and asking careful questions about pain levels and circulation. The boy was healing well, but would need several more days of careful monitoring before any attempt at mobility. "Are you really a doctor?" Marco asked as Ben adjusted his pillows. "No, just someone who's learned to help when people get hurt. I was in the National Guard for a while, learned basic medical skills there. Then living in a small town, you pick up things as you go. People need help. You figure out how to give it." "My mom's really smart," Marco offered, as if this were relevant information Ben should know. "She knows about computers and business stuff. She built a whole company." "That's impressive," Ben replied, though he could hear the subtle defensive note in the boy's voice. "It takes a lot of intelligence and hard work to build something from nothing. Some kids at my old school said she was too busy for me because of work, but that's not true. She takes me places and we do things together. Like yesterday, we were exploring before the storm came." Ben nodded, recognizing the conversation for what it was, a 12-year-old's attempt to explain and defend his family structure to this adult, who represented a completely different way of living. "I can tell she loves you very much. The way she stayed right beside you yesterday, took care of you. That's what parents do when they love their children." Marco seemed satisfied with this assessment, settling back into his pillows with visible relief. Children, Ben had learned, were constantly testing the stability of their world, seeking reassurance that the love they depended on was real and permanent. From the kitchen came the aroma of coffee and something that smelled suspiciously like pancakes. Ben's stomach rumbled, reminding him that he'd eaten very little the previous day, too focused on his unexpected patients to pay attention to his own needs. "Breakfast." Lily called, appearing in the doorway with flour smudged on her cheek and pride radiating from her small frame. Clara helped me make pancakes that aren't lumpy. The meal was a careful dance of politeness and uncertainty. Clara had found Ben's wife's apron, the one with small roses that he'd never had the heart to put away, and wore it with unconscious grace as she served food and poured coffee. She moved efficiently in the small kitchen, but Ben noticed how. She paused before opening each cabinet, seeking permission with her eyes before touching anything. "This is really good," Marco said around a mouthful of pancake, his appetite apparently returning with his strength. "The secret is not overmixing the batter," Clara explained to Lily, who absorbed this information with the seriousness of an apprentice learning from a master. "Too much stirring makes them tough." "Mama used to make pancakes on Sundays," Lily said casually. Ben looked quickly at Ben, as if checking whether mentioning Sarah was allowed. "She did," Ben confirmed gently. "These are just as good as hers were." Clara's hands stilled for just a moment on her coffee cup, her eyes finding Ben's across the small table. In them, he saw recognition of loss, understanding of the careful balance required to honor the past while building something in the present. She didn't ask questions or offer sympathy, just acknowledged the information with a small nod and continued eating after breakfast. The reality of their situation settled around them like dust after a windstorm. Marco couldn't be moved safely for several more days. Clara's phone, when it finally caught signal, revealed 17 missed calls from her office and a string of increasingly urgent text messages about meetings and deals that couldn't wait. "I have to make some calls," she announced, her executive persona sliding back into place like armor. "Important meetings this week?" She stepped onto the front porch with her phone, and through the window Ben could see her pacing, her free hand gesturing as she spoke in the clipped, efficient tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Even from a distance, he could read the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like a general marshaling troops for battle. "Is she angry at us?" Lily asked quietly, watching Clara through the window. "No, sweetheart, she's not angry. She's just, her work is very demanding. She has people depending on her, important decisions to make. Being here when she planned to be somewhere else is stressful. Like when you had to miss my school play because Mrs. Patterson's roof collapsed." "Something like that," Ben agreed, though he suspected Clara's professional obligations carried stakes far higher than anything he'd ever faced. When Clara returned from her calls, her face was carefully neutral, but Ben caught the slight tremor in her hands as she tucked the phone away. Whatever conversations she'd had, they hadn't gone well. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. "Fine," she replied, the word carrying all the weight of things that were decidedly not fine. "Just some scheduling complications. Nothing that can't be managed." But as the day wore on, Ben noticed the way she checked her phone compulsively, the tight line of worry that appeared between her eyebrows when she thought no one was looking. Clara Rivera, successful businesswoman, was stranded in a carpenter's house in a town that probably didn't appear on most maps, and the world she'd built was continuing to spin without her. The afternoon brought visits from concerned neighbors, Mrs. Chun with homemade soup, the Henderson family checking if Ben needed anything, old Tom Mitchell offering the use of his truck if transportation became necessary. Each visitor was introduced to Clara and Marco with the casual courtesy of small-town life. But Ben noticed how Clara's shoulders tensed with each new face, how she seemed to shrink slightly under their curious, well-intentioned attention. "People are very friendly here," she observed after the Hendersons left, carrying a note of someone still processing an unexpected experience. "They're good people," Ben replied. "They look out for each other. When Sarah was sick, there wasn't a day someone didn't stop by with food or help or just to sit with her while I worked. Community matters when everything else falls apart." Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching through the window as Lily played in the yard with the Henderson children who had lingered after their parents left. "I don't think Marco has ever experienced anything like this." "We don't," Our life is more private. Privacy has its place, Ben said carefully. But so does connection. Both have their cost and their value. As evening approached, Clara retrieved her designer handbag from where it had sat forgotten since the previous day, pulling out a sleek laptop that looked like it cost more than Ben's monthly grocery budget. She settled at his kitchen table, the expensive technology looking alien against the worn wood surface, and began typing with the focused intensity of someone trying to rebuild a crumbling dam with her bare hands. Ben left her to her work, tending to Marco and helping Lily with her bedtime routine. But he was conscious of Clara's presence at his table, the soft clicking of keys that continued long into the night, the weight of her worry filling the small house like storm pressure. Whatever world she belonged to, it was pulling at her even from a distance, reminding both of them that this temporary arrangement existed in a bubble that would eventually have to burst. By the third day, the artificial politeness that had cushioned their interactions began to wear thin, replaced by something more genuine but infinitely more complicated. Clara woke before dawn, moving quietly through Ben's kitchen as she made coffee with the reverent care of someone for whom caffeine was a sacrament. Ben found her there when he emerged from his makeshift bedroom on the living room floor, standing at the window, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, not wanting to wake the children. "I'm not used to this," she replied, gesturing vaguely at the peaceful scene outside. "The quiet. Where I live, there's always noise, traffic, sirens, construction. Here, you can actually hear birds singing." Ben poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made, noting that it was stronger than his usual brew, but perfectly smooth. "City living has its advantages, I'm sure. Better hospitals, for one thing. Marco would have been in an emergency room within 20 minutes instead of laid up on my couch for days." Clara turned from the window, studying his face in the early morning light. "Do you regret it? Living here instead of somewhere with more opportunities?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. Most people danced around such personal territory, but Clara seemed to approach conversation the way she probably approached business, with unflinching honesty about uncomfortable realities. "I used to," Ben admitted, surprising himself with the confession. "When Sarah first got sick, I thought about moving somewhere with better medical facilities, more specialists. But she loved this place, loved the community. And after, well, Lily's roots are here. Her friends, her school, the people who knew her mother. Sometimes what looks like a limitation from the outside feels like security from the inside." Clara nodded slowly, as if filing this information away for later consideration. "I grew up in a place like this. Smaller, even. I couldn't wait to leave, to build something bigger than what my parents had." "Did you? Build something bigger?" A shadow crossed her face. "I built something different. Whether it's bigger," she shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass years of second-guessing and complex regrets. "Marco's father thought it was too big, too demanding. He said I loved my company more than my family." The words hung in the air between them, confession and explanation wrapped together. Ben waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. "He wasn't entirely wrong," Clara continued quietly. "When you build something from nothing, every day feels like it might be the day it all falls apart. You work longer, worry more, sacrifice things you tell yourself you can sacrifice later when everything's more secure. But later keeps moving further away." From the living room came the sound of Marco stirring, his voice calling softly for his. "Mother." Clara set down her coffee and moved toward him with the efficient grace Ben was learning to associate with her, every movement purposeful, every action serving multiple functions. "How's the pain this morning, sweetheart?" she asked, settling beside the couch to check his splint with hands that had learned surprising competence over the past few days. "Better," Marco replied, though Ben could see the careful way he held himself that indicated ongoing discomfort. "When can I get up and walk around?" "Soon," Ben answered, joining them in the living room. "Another day or two of rest, and we can try some light movement. Your body's doing good work healing that bone." "I'm bored," Marco announced with the frank honesty of 12-year-old patience reaching its limits. "I know, buddy. Being laid up is tough. What do you usually do when you're homesick?" "Video games, mostly. Or watch movies on Mom's big TV. But there's no internet here, is there?" Ben shook his head apologetically. "Afraid not. We're a bit behind the times in Willow Creek, but I might have some alternatives if you're interested." He disappeared into his workshop, returning with a wooden box that had belonged to his father. Inside, carefully wrapped in soft cloth, were hand tools sized for smaller hands, chisels, small planes, carving knives that had been made for teaching children the basics of woodworking. "My dad started teaching me when I was about your age," Ben explained, settling the box on the coffee table within Marco's reach. "Figured you might like to try carving something while you're stuck on that couch." Marco's eyes lit up with genuine interest, his hands reaching for the tools with the reverence of someone discovering treasure. "Really? You'd let me use these?" "With supervision," Clara interjected quickly. "Those look very sharp." "They are," Ben agreed, "but that's what makes them work properly. Dull tools are more dangerous than sharp ones. They slip and cut unexpectedly. Sharp tools do exactly what you tell them to do, if you respect them." He spent the next hour teaching Marco the basics: how to hold the wood, how to angle the blade, how to read the grain and work with it instead of against it. Clara watched from the kitchen, ostensibly working on her laptop, but clearly keeping one eye on her son's introduction to this ancient craft. Lily joined them when she woke, immediately fascinated by the idea of making things from wood. Soon Ben found himself teaching both children, their heads bent together over pieces of soft pine as they learned to coax simple shapes from the raw material. "This is harder than it looks," Marco muttered, concentrating fiercely on what was intended to be a small boat, but currently resembled an abstract sculpture. "Most worthwhile things are," Ben replied. "But that's what makes them satisfying when you get them right. Anyone can buy something from a store. Making it yourself, that's different. That's putting part of yourself into something that will last." Clara appeared beside them, coffee cup in hand, watching her son's careful attempts at craftsmanship. "Your father would have a heart attack if he could see you with those knives," she said lightly, but Ben caught the underlying tension in her voice. "He doesn't like me doing things like this. He thinks it's beneath you. That you should focus on academic subjects, preparation for college and career. Practical skills are for people who don't have other options." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread outward from their impact. Ben felt the familiar sting of class consciousness, the subtle dismissal of the work that filled his days and gave his life meaning. "There's no shame in working with your hands," he said quietly, his voice carrying the patient dignity of someone who had heard such dismissals before. "Creating something useful and beautiful, that's as worthy as any other work." "I know that," Clara replied quickly, recognizing the hurt she'd inadvertently caused. "I didn't mean my ex-husband has very fixed ideas about success and status. They're not necessarily my ideas." The moment stretched awkwardly until Lily, with the social intuition of childhood, broke the tension by proudly displaying her carving, a lumpy but recognizable bird that she declared was a robin. "It's beautiful, little bird," Ben said, using her pet name deliberately to restore the warmth to the room. "Your first piece. We'll have to put your name on it." The rest of the morning passed more easily, the children absorbed in their projects, while the adults navigated the complex dance of strangers learning to share space. Clara made lunch sandwiches constructed with the precise attention to detail she apparently brought to everything, while Ben worked nearby, sanding the Henderson rocking chair to its final smoothness. "You really love this," Clara observed, watching his hands move over the wood with practiced sensitivity. "The woodworking, I mean. It's not just work for you." "It's the closest thing to meditation I know," Ben replied. "When I'm working on a piece, everything else falls away. There's just the wood, the tools, and the thing I'm trying to create. Pure focus." "I used to feel that way about coding," Clara said softly. "Back when I was writing programs instead of managing people who write programs. There's something similar about it, taking raw materials, whether wood or data, and shaping them into something functional and elegant." "What changed? Success, I suppose?" "The bigger the company got, the further I moved from actually building things to just managing the business of building things. It's different. Important, but different." They worked in companionable quiet. For a while, each lost in their own tasks, but somehow connected by the shared rhythm of purposeful activity. It was Clara who broke the silence, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "I can't remember the last time I spent a whole morning without checking my email." Ben looked up from his sanding. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying," she admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "But also lighter, somehow. Like I've been holding my breath for years, and just now remembered how to exhale." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Ben was helping Marco attempt his first tentative steps with improvised crutches when a sleek black car pulled into his driveway, as out of place in Willow Creek as a spaceship would have been. The man who emerged wore an expensive suit and the harried expression of someone accustomed to having his calls returned immediately. "Mrs. Rivera?" he called, approaching the porch with the brisk efficiency of a courier delivering urgent documents. "I'm James Patterson, from your legal team. Mr. Hawthorne sent me to brief you on the Morrison acquisition. We have some decisions that can't wait." Clara's transformation was immediate and startling. The relaxed woman who had been laughing at Marco's clumsy attempts with the crutches disappeared, replaced by the executive Ben was beginning to recognize as her professional armor. Her spine straightened, her face became a mask of composed attention, and when she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "Of course. Let's talk." It disappeared into the house, leaving Ben and the children on the porch with the awkward awareness that their temporary domestic bubble had just been punctured by reality. Through the window, Ben could see Clara and a lawyer bent over documents. Her laptop opened between them, the outside world reasserting its claim on her attention. "Is Mom going to have to leave?" Marco asked quietly, his newfound mobility forgotten in the face of familiar anxiety. "I don't know, buddy," Ben replied honestly. "But whatever happens, we'll make sure you're taken care of. That's a promise." As the afternoon wore on, the lawyer's visit stretched into evening, the black car sitting in Ben's driveway like a reminder of all the ways their worlds didn't align. When Patterson finally left, Clara remained standing in the doorway, her hand on the frame as if she needed its support. "Everything all right?" Ben asked carefully. "There's a deal," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "A big one. A kind that changes everything for the company, for Marco's future, for—" She trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging unfinished. But it requires my presence. Not just phone calls and video conferences. Face-to-face meetings, negotiations, decisions that have to be made in real time." She looked at Marco, who was pretending to read, but clearly listening to every word. "I may have to go back sooner than we planned." The weight of her words settled over them like dusk, marking the end of something that had barely begun, but had already changed them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. The next morning brought a different quality of urgency to the house, as if the lawyer's visit had introduced a ticking clock that counted down to an inevitable separation. Clara's phone buzzed with the persistence of an angry wasp, each notification pulling her attention away from the careful domestic routine they had built together. Ben watched her field calls between breakfast preparations, her voice shifting seamlessly between languages: English with her American team, rapid Spanish with what sounded like international partners, and crisp, professional tones that seemed to come from a different person entirely than the woman who had learned to make unlumpy pancakes. "The Jakarta team needs an answer by Thursday," she explained to someone on the other end of the line, her free hand absently stroking Marco's hair as he leaned against her while eating cereal. "No, I understand the time constraints, but—" She paused, listening, and Ben saw the moment her executive mask slipped to reveal genuine frustration. "Because my son is injured, and I'm not leaving him until he's properly healed. That's why." Marco looked up at this, his spoon halfway to his mouth, surprise and something that might have been relief flickering across his young face. Ben felt a corresponding tightness in his chest, the recognition that Clara was fighting battles on multiple fronts, trying to protect her professional obligations while refusing to abandon her child. "How bad is it?" Ben asked quietly when she ended the call. Clara set down her phone with the careful control of someone resisting the urge to throw it against the wall. "Bad. The Morrison acquisition, it's a company in renewable energy technology. Exactly the kind of forward-thinking investment that could position us for the next decade. But there are 3 other firms bidding, and this isn't the kind of negotiation you can do remotely. What happens if you miss it? We stay a mid-sized, regional company instead of becoming a national player. Marco's college fund stays comfortable instead of becoming generational wealth. I stay someone who built something decent instead of someone who built something extraordinary." She looked out the window at Lily, who was teaching Marco to feed the chickens from his wheelchair, a contraption Ben had improvised from an old office chair and some careful engineering. "It's not the end of the world, but it's the end of a particular kind of future." Ben poured himself more coffee, weighing his words carefully. "Sounds like you've got a choice to make." "Do I?" Clara's laugh held no humor. "My son has a broken leg. We're stranded in a town where the nearest real hospital is an hour away, and I'm supposed to be in San Francisco tomorrow for meetings that could change everything." "What choice is that?" Before Ben could answer, the sound of Marco's laughter drifted through the window, genuine, delighted laughter, as Lily demonstrated what she claimed was the proper way to call chickens. Clara's expression softened as she watched her son, noting the color that had returned to his cheeks, the animation that had replaced the pale withdrawal of the first days. "He looks happy," Ben observed. "He does," Clara agreed quietly. "Happier than he's been in months, maybe longer." "That's worth something." "Worth what, though?" "Worth his future opportunities. Worth the financial security I've spent 12 years building. Worth letting down the 150 people who work for my company and depend on my decisions." She turned from the window, her executive persona reasserting itself like armor sliding back into place. "I have responsibilities, Ben. To more people than just Marco." "Of course you do. I'm not suggesting otherwise." Ben paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood he was venturing into territory that wasn't really his business. "What's the point of building financial security if you're too busy building it to enjoy what it's supposed to protect?" Clara's phone buzzed again, and this time she ignored it. Then it buzzed a second time and a third, until the persistent electronic demanding became impossible to disregard. "I have to take this," she said, already reaching for the device. But as she lifted it to her ear, Marco's voice cut through the morning air with startling clarity. "Mom, look, I can stand up by myself." Clara froze, phone halfway to her ear, watching through the window as her son carefully levered himself out of the wheelchair using the makeshift crutches Ben had fashioned from old fence posts and cushioning. Marco's face was bright with triumph, his whole body radiating the pride of a milestone achieved through patience and determination. The phone continued to buzz in Clara's hand. She stared at it for a long moment, then deliberately powered it off. "The call can wait," she said, moving toward the back door. "This can't." Ben watched her hurry outside to celebrate Marco's progress, noting the way her shoulders lost their rigid executive posture as she knelt to embrace her son. Through the window, he could see the three of them, Clara, Marco, and Lily, forming a small constellation of connection in his backyard. And something in his chest both expanded and contracted at the sight. The morning dissolved into the kind of easy routine that felt both natural and impossible. Clara worked with focused determination to catch up on emails while Marco practiced his mobility under Ben's careful supervision. Lily appointed herself head cheerleader and physical therapist, offering encouragement and invented exercises with equal enthusiasm. "You're really good at this," Clara observed, watching Ben guide Marco through range of motion exercises that would strengthen the muscles around his healing bone. "The medical stuff, I mean. You could have been a physical therapist, maybe even a doctor." "Different life," Ben replied, supporting Marco's weight as the boy attempted a few careful steps. "This one suits me fine. But don't you ever wonder about the paths you didn't take?" Ben was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the weight it deserved. "I used to, especially after Sarah died, when everything felt like it had been reduced to survival mode. But wondering about other lives is a luxury you can afford when the life you have is stable. When it's not," he shrugged, "you focus on the next step, literally and figuratively. That's very practical. Practicality isn't glamorous, but it keeps the lights on and food on the table. Sometimes that's enough." Clara studied him with the same intense focus she brought to business problems, as if he were a puzzle she was trying to solve. "I don't think I know how to be practical. I've spent so long thinking in terms of growth, expansion, competitive advantage. Sometimes I forget there's value in just maintaining something good." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Shunn, bearing a casserole dish and the kind of determined cheerfulness that indicated a mission beyond simple neighborly concern. "How are our patients today?" she asked brightly, though her eyes were conducting a thorough inspection of the domestic arrangements visible through the open door. "Improving nicely," Ben replied, recognizing the signs of community curiosity wrapped in helpful concern. "Marco's up and moving around." "Wonderful. And Clara, dear, how are you managing? It must be so difficult, being away from your regular routine." Clara handled the gentle interrogation with diplomatic skill, answering questions without revealing too much, expressing gratitude while maintaining appropriate boundaries. But Ben could see the tension in her posture, the way she seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of small-town attention that meant, well, but felt invasive to someone accustomed to privacy. After Margaret left, Clara stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes with unnecessary vigor, her movements sharp with suppressed frustration. "She means well," Ben offered. "I know she does. They all do. But it's like living in a fishbowl. In the city, anonymity is a given. Here, everyone wants to know your story, wants to understand how you fit into their world. That bothers you." "It terrifies me," Clara admitted, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. "What if I don't fit? What if the story they want isn't the story I am?" Ben moved to stand beside her, taking the dish from her hands and placing it gently in the drying rack. "What story do you think they want? The fairy tale version? Successful career woman discovers the simple life, realizes that money can't buy happiness, finds love with a good-hearted working man who shows her what really matters." Clara's voice carried a note of self-mockery. "Very neat, very satisfying, very unrealistic. What makes it unrealistic?" "Because real life is messier than that. Because I can't just abandon 12 years of building something that employs over 100 people. Because the kind of love story that works in movies requires sacrifices that actual adults with actual responsibilities can't make." Ben dried his hands slowly, thinking about the weight of her words. What if it's not about abandoning anything? What if it's about finding a different way to balance things? Such as? I don't know, Ben admitted. But I know that problems that seem impossible sometimes have solutions you can't see until you stop trying to solve them the old way. Clara turned from the sink, leaning against the counter as she studied his face. You really believe that? I have to. The alternative is giving up on things before you've explored all the possibilities. And what possibilities do you see here? Ben, realistically? The question hung between them, weighted with more than curiosity. Ben could feel the moment expanding, becoming one of those conversations that changes relationships irrevocably simply by virtue of being spoken aloud. I see two people who care about their children more than anything else, he said carefully. I see someone who's built something extraordinary through intelligence and determination, and someone who's learned to find contentment in smaller but no less meaningful work. I see the possibility that different strengths might complement each other instead of competing. And I see someone who deserves more than a part-time relationship with a woman who's constantly torn between competing obligations. Shouldn't that be my decision to make? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between Ben's face and the window where their children were absorbed in some elaborate game involving Lily's stuffed animals and Marco's growing mobility. I powered off my phone this morning, she said finally. First time, probably 5 years that I've been completely unreachable for more than an hour. Do you know what I felt? What? Relief. Pure, absolute relief. And that scares me more than any business deal ever has. The wooden horse took shape slowly under Ben's patient hands, each curl of the plane revealing grain patterns that seemed to flow like water frozen in amber. He worked in the evening quiet of his workshop, while Clara helped the children with what Lily generously called homework, though. Marco's educational needs were far more advanced than anything Willow Creek Elementary typically handled. The derivative of x squared is 2x. Marco was explaining to Lily with the serious patience of someone who had learned that teaching. Others helped solidify his own understanding. It's like, imagine you're carving wood, but instead of taking off the same amount everywhere, you take off more and more as you go along the piece. Ben smiled at the analogy, noting how quickly the boy had absorbed not just the technique of woodworking, but its underlying principles. There was something deeply satisfying about watching a young mind make connections between seemingly disparate concepts, mathematics and craftsmanship, finding common ground in the careful application of incremental change. That's actually a brilliant way to explain it, Clara said from her position at the kitchen table, where she was attempting to balance her laptop work with supervising the impromptu tutoring session. Where did you learn to think about math that way? Ben showed me how the curves in wood follow mathematical patterns, Marco replied, gesturing toward the workshop with a soft rasp of the plane continued its meditative rhythm. He said everything that grows follows rules, even if we don't always understand what they are. Clara looked up from her screen, her attention fully caught by this unexpected revelation. He said that. He says lots of interesting things. Like how you can tell the character of a tree by how it responds to wind and weather, and how the best furniture isn't the fanciest, but the kind that becomes more beautiful with age and use. Marco paused in his mathematical explanation, his young face serious with the weight of new ideas. He thinks like you do, Mom, but about different things. What do you mean? You both see patterns that other people miss. You see them in business and computers. He sees them in wood and how things grow. But it's the same kind of seeing. From her position cross-legged on the floor, Lily nodded sagely. Daddy says the wood tells him what it wants to become, and then he helps it get there. Like how you helped our pancakes become not lumpy. Clara sat back in her chair, struck by the unexpected profundity of children's observations. In the workshop, Ben's plane fell silent, and she could see him through the doorway, examining his work with the focused attention she recognized from her own moments of deep concentration. What's he making? She asked. A horse for me, Marco said proudly. He said every boy should have something carved just for him, something that will last long enough to pass down to his own children someday. The simple statement hit Clara with unexpected force. In her world, permanence was measured in quarterly earnings and market share, success calculated in growth percentages and competitive positioning. The idea of creating something specifically designed to outlast its maker, to carry meaning across generations through nothing more than careful craftsmanship and intentional love, felt almost revolutionary. "Can I see it?" she asked. Marco nodded enthusiastically, levering himself up on his crutches with the improved confidence of several days' practice. They made their way to the workshop, where Ben looked up from his work with a slightly dazed expression of someone returning from deep focus. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt," Clara said, but Ben shook his head. "No interruption. I was just finishing the rough shaping." He held up the wooden horse, its form still blocky but unmistakably equine, the suggestion of movement captured in the curve of neck and the angle of legs. "Still a ways to go, but you can see where it's headed." Clara reached out to touch the smooth wood, surprised by its warmth under her fingers. "It's beautiful. The grain is so alive." "Cherry wood," Ben explained, his voice carrying the quiet pride of someone sharing expertise he genuinely loved. "This piece came from a tree that grew for maybe 60 years before it was harvested. All that time, all that weather and growth, it's still there in the wood, if you know how to read it." "How do you read it?" "The rings tell you about wet years and dry years, about which side faced the wind, about times when the tree had to grow around obstacles or reach for light." Ben's hands moved over the wood as he spoke, tracing patterns Clara was only beginning to perceive. "This horse will carry all of that history. Marco won't just own a toy, he'll own a piece of time itself." "That's," Clara paused, searching for words adequate to the concept. "That's extraordinary. I never thought about objects having that kind of continuity." "Most people don't. We live in a world of planned obsolescence, where things are designed to be replaced rather than preserved. But there's something to be said for making things that last, things that connect us to both the past and the future." Clara watched his hands as he spoke, noting the way they moved with unconscious grace, shaped by years of practice into instruments of both strength and delicacy. These were hands that could split wood with an axe or coax the finest detail from a piece of carving. Hands that had learned to find beauty in raw material and patience in the slow process of revelation. "My father would have said this was a waste of time," Marco observed, running his own smaller hands along the horse's emerging mane. "He thinks anything that doesn't contribute to career advancement or academic achievement is essentially frivolous." "What do you think?" Ben asked, his tone carefully neutral. Marco considered this with the gravity of someone whose opinion had been requested rather than assumed. "I think maybe there are different kinds of smart. School smart, like knowing calculus and speaking multiple languages. Business smart, like building companies and making deals. But also this kind of smart, knowing how things grow, how to make something beautiful with your hands, how to see what's hidden inside a piece of wood." "All three kinds are valuable," Clara said quietly, though Ben could hear the note of discovery in her voice, as if she were testing new ideas against her established beliefs. "The world needs people who can do all of those things. But our world, mine and Mom's, doesn't really have room for the third kind." Marco continued with startling insight. "Everything's about efficiency and productivity and measurable outcomes. Making something beautiful just because it's beautiful, that doesn't fit." The workshop fell quiet, except for the distant sound of Lily singing to herself in the house, her voice carrying the unself-conscious joy of childhood. Clara felt the weight of her son's observation, the recognition that the life she had built for them, successful as it was by conventional measures, might have excluded entire categories of human experience. "It could fit," Ben said gently. "If." You wanted it to. There's no law that says you can't make room for beauty alongside efficiency, craftsmanship alongside productivity. Isn't there? Clara asked. In my world, time is the ultimate currency. Every hour spent on something that doesn't directly contribute to growth or competitive advantage is an hour your competitors are gaining on you. And what happens when you win? When you've outgrown and outcompeted everyone else? What then? The question hung in the air like sawdust, settling slowly into the corners of consciousness. Clara had spent so many years focused on the next milestone, the next expansion, the next market to conquer, that she had rarely allowed herself to consider what lay beyond the horizon of endless growth. I don't know, she admitted. I suppose I always assumed I'd figure that out when I got there. The thing about horizons, Ben said, returning his attention to the wooden horse, is that they keep moving as you approach them. Maybe the secret isn't reaching them, but learning to appreciate the journey. As they returned to the house, Clara found herself seeing the space with new eyes. The worn hardwood floors that had been polished by 3 generations of Carter feet, the kitchen table scarred by decades of family meals and homework sessions, the quilts folded over chair backs. Everything bore the patina of time, and used that, gave objects character rather than diminishing their value. Mom, Marco said as she helped him settle back into his chair, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were my age, what did you want to be when you grew up? The question was simple, but Clara found herself struggling to remember that younger version of herself, the girl who had dreamed before learning to calculate probabilities and assess risk factors. A teacher, she said finally, surprising herself with the answer. I wanted to be a teacher. I loved learning new things and then figuring out how to explain them to other people so they could understand too. Like how you taught Lily about pancake batter? Yes, I suppose so. Though I haven't thought about that in a very long time. Why didn't you become a teacher? Clara settled into the chair beside him, her laptop forgotten for the moment. Because teachers don't make very much money, and I wanted to be able to take care of myself, to never depend on anyone else for security. So I chose a path that offered more financial opportunity. Do you miss it? Teaching, I mean? Clara paused, realizing that in all her years of building and achieving, she had never asked herself that question. I don't know. Maybe. I love watching you learn things. Love seeing that moment when a concept clicks into place. There's something magical about being part of someone else's understanding. Through the window, she could see Ben in his workshop, bent over the wooden horse, with the concentrated attention of someone lost in purposeful work. There was something deeply appealing about that kind of focus, that marriage of skill and intention that produced something both useful and beautiful. Phone, abandoned on the kitchen counter, began to buzz with the familiar urgency of the outside world reasserting its demands. Clara looked at it, then at Marco, absorbed in explaining mathematical concepts to Lily, then back at the phone. For the second time that day, she deliberately let it ring unanswered, choosing presence over productivity, connection over efficiency. It was a small rebellion, but it felt like the beginning of something larger, a crack in the armor of assumptions she had built around herself, letting in light she hadn't realized she was missing. The call came at 6 a.m, jarring Clara from the deepest sleep she'd experienced in months. Her phone, which she'd taken to leaving in the kitchen overnight, buzzed insistently against the wooden table like an angry insect. Through the thin walls of Ben's modest house, she could hear him stirring in the living room, no doubt awakened by the same electronic invasion of their carefully constructed peace. Clara Rivera, she answered, her voice thick with sleep and instinctive dread. Clara, thank God. The voice belonged to David Hawthorne, her business partner and the closest thing she had to a best friend in the corporate world. But his usual calm was fractured, replaced by something approaching panic. Where the hell have you been? I've been calling for hours. David, it's 6 a.m. What's wrong? Everything. The Morrison deal fell through. They went with Texan Industries. Instead, said we were too unreliable to partner with. Apparently, your disappearance raised questions about our company's stability and leadership continuity. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her free hand gripping the edge of the table for support. They can't do that. We had preliminary agreements, verbal commitments, which mean exactly nothing when the CEO vanishes for a week without proper communication protocols in place. Clara, they're questioning your fitness to lead. The board is asking questions I can't answer because I don't know where you are or what's going on. Through the doorway, Clara could see Ben moving quietly in the living room, checking on Marco while trying not to eavesdrop on her conversation. But sound carried in the small house, and she knew he could hear the edge of crisis in her voice. It's not that simple, David. Marco was injured. I understand that, and I'm sorry. But you have responsibilities beyond your personal situation. We have employees depending on us, investors who trusted us with their money, clients who expect professional reliability. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of two worlds pulling her in opposite directions with increasing force. What are you telling me, David? I'm telling you that if you're not back in the office by Monday morning, ready to do damage control and salvage what we can of our reputation, there might not be a company to come back to. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 12 years of shared work, shared dreams, shared sacrifices that had built something from nothing. Clara could hear the genuine anguish in David's voice. He wasn't trying to manipulate her or force an impossible choice. He was simply stating the brutal mathematics of business reality. How bad is it? She asked quietly. Bad. 3 major clients have called emergency meetings to reassess their partnerships. The trade publications are starting to ask questions about leadership stability. Our stock price has dropped 15% in 2 days. David's voice carried the hollow exhaustion of someone who had been fighting fires alone for too long. Clara, I can't hold this together by myself. I never could. You're the vision, the driving force. Without you here, we're just another mid-sized tech company with good intentions and limited resources. Clara looked through the window at Ben's workshop, where she could see the wooden horse taking shape on his workbench. Such a simple thing, wood and skill and patience combining to create something that would last. How different that was from the complex, fragile empire of contracts and relationships and market confidence that she had spent years building. I need 24 hours, she said finally. Clara, 24 hours, David. I'll call you tomorrow morning with my decision. She ended the call before he could protest, setting the phone down with hands that trembled slightly. The kitchen felt different, now smaller, more confining, as if the walls were closing in under the pressure of the outside world's demands. Bad news? Ben's voice was gentle, careful not to intrude, but offering support if she needed it. The worst. Clara turned to face him, noting the way morning light caught the silver in his hair, the patient strength in his posture as he waited for her to decide how much to share. The business deal I mentioned? It fell through. Because I've been here. Instead of there, people are questioning my commitment, my reliability. My company is in trouble. Ben moved to the coffee maker, beginning the familiar ritual of morning preparation with hands that stayed steady despite the tension filling the room. How much trouble? The kind that could undo everything I've spent 12 years building. The kind that could cost 150 people their jobs because their CEO chose to stay with her injured son instead of attending to business. That's not a fair choice to have to make. Fair doesn't enter into it. It's just reality. Clara accepted the coffee he offered, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic mug as if it could anchor her to this peaceful kitchen, this moment of calm before the storm fully hit. They need me back immediately. Monday morning, full commitment, all hands on deck to salvage what we can. And Marco? That's the question, isn't it? He's mobile now, healing well. Technically, he could travel if we're careful about it. Ben was quiet for a moment, and Clara could see him processing the implications, understanding that their week of domestic tranquility was about to end whether any of them wanted it to or not. What will you do? The question she'd been dreading, because she didn't know the answer. Or rather, because she knew the answer, but couldn't bear to speak it aloud yet. I don't know, she lied. I honestly don't know. But she did know. Had known. From the moment David's voice carried the weight of genuine crisis through the phone lines. She was going to leave. Had to leave. The mathematics were inescapable. Her personal happiness weighed against the livelihoods of her employees. The security of Marco's future balanced against the immediate pleasure of his. Contentment. The morning progressed with the surreal quality of normal activities performed under the shadow of impending change. Clara helped make breakfast, watched Marco practice with his crutches, listened to Lily's elaborate plans for the day. But part of her mind was already in San Francisco, calculating damage control strategies and preparing for the conversations. That would determine whether 12 years of work could be salvaged. Around noon, a second phone call shattered what remained of their fragile peace. This time, it was Marco's father, Richard, calling from London where some business conference had taken him. His voice, when Clara answered, carried the clipped disapproval she remembered all too well. I just heard about Marco's accident from his school. They said he's been absent for over a week. Where exactly are you, Clara? We're in a small town called Willow Creek. Marco broke his leg in a cycling accident, and we've been staying with the man who helped him until he's well enough to travel. Staying with a stranger? Have you lost your mind? Get Marco to a proper hospital immediately. He's been receiving excellent care. The break is healing perfectly, and he's mobile now. Excellent care from some small-town amateur while you play house in the middle of nowhere? This is exactly the kind of irresponsible behavior that led to our divorce, Clara. Your inability to prioritize what's actually important. Clara felt her temper flare, the old familiar anger at Richard's assumption that he alone understood what was best for their son. What's important is Marco's well-being, which has been my only concern. His well-being includes his education, his proper medical care, and his mother not having some kind of breakdown that jeopardizes her company, and therefore his financial future. I'm flying back tomorrow. I expect Marco to be in a proper medical facility by the time I arrive. The call ended with Richard's characteristic abruptness, leaving Clara staring at her phone as if it were a venomous snake. Through the window, she could see Marco and Lily in the backyard, the boy demonstrating his improved mobility, while Ben watched with the quiet pride of a teacher seeing his students succeed. Another problem? Ben asked, though his tone suggested. He'd heard enough to understand the general nature of the conversation. Marco's father. He's displeased with our arrangements. He's demanding I move Marco to a hospital immediately. Medically, that's not necessary. Marco's healing exactly as he should. Medical necessity isn't really the issue. Richard sees this whole situation as evidence of my poor judgment and unreliable priorities. Clara sat heavily at the kitchen table, feeling the weight of multiple crises converging like storm fronts. He's probably not wrong. About which part? Maybe all of it. Maybe staying here, letting Marco get attached to this life, letting myself imagine that things could be different maybe. That was all just elaborate self-deception. Ben joined her at the table, his presence solid and reassuring, even as everything else felt like it was dissolving. Or maybe it was the first honest choice you've made in years. Honest doesn't pay the bills, Ben. Honest doesn't provide for employees who depend on their jobs or secure Marco's future. Honest is a luxury I can't afford. What if you're wrong? What if honest is the only thing you can afford? Before Clara could answer, Marco appeared in the doorway, his face bright with excitement. Mom, look! I can walk without the crutches for short distances. Penn says By next week, I'll barely need them at all." Clara looked at her son, really looked at him, noting the color in his cheeks, the confidence in his posture, the joy that seemed to radiate from him like sunlight. In the past week, he had learned to carve wood, made a genuine friend in Lily, discovered that there were adults who had time to really listen to his questions and ideas. He had experienced a different way of being in the world, one measured not by achievement and advancement, but by presence and connection. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Ben's going to finish the horse today, and he said maybe tomorrow we could start a new project, something I could take with me when we go home, so I'll always remember how to do woodworking." The innocent words hit Clara like physical blows. Take with him when they go home. A tangible reminder of this interlude, this brief taste of a different kind of life that would have to sustain them through whatever came next. "But that," she began, then stopped, unable to find words that could bridge the gap between Marco's excitement and the reality of the phone calls that had shattered their peaceful morning. "We have to leave, don't we?" Marco asked, his perceptiveness cutting through her attempt at gentle preparation. "Something's wrong with your company, and Dad's angry, and we have to go back." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Marco was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between his mother's face and the window that framed his new friend playing in the yard. "When?" "Tomorrow," Clara said softly. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so very sorry." The afternoon that followed felt like a wake, each normal activity tinged with the melancholy of last times. Clara made phone calls, arranging flights and hospital transfers, and the complex logistics of re-entering the world she had temporarily left behind. Ben worked with quiet determination to finish the wooden horse, as if completing this gift could somehow make up for all the other things he couldn't give them. And Marco, with the resilience of childhood, threw himself into one final day of simple pleasures feeding chickens, teaching Lily advanced mathematical concepts, helping Ben sand the horse's mane to silken smoothness. As evening settled over Willow Creek, Clara found herself standing in Ben's workshop, watching him apply the final coat of finish to Marco's gift. The horse gleamed in the lamplight, every curve and detail speaking of hours of patient labor, of skill applied with love rather than for profit. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's a beginning," Ben replied. "Something for him to build on, whenever he's ready." "And us?" Clara asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "What are we?" Ben set down his brush, turning to face her with eyes that held both sadness and understanding. "We're a story that got cut short, but that doesn't make it any less real for the time it lasted. I don't want it to be over." "Neither do I, but wanting and having are different things, aren't they?" Clara nodded, tears threatening to spill over as she faced the truth she'd been avoiding all day. Tomorrow would bring a return to her real life, to the world of obligations and responsibilities that left no room for wooden horses and quiet mornings, and the radical possibility of enough being sufficient. "Will you remember us?" she asked. "Every day," Ben replied without hesitation. "The question is whether you'll remember this. Remember that there are other ways to live, other definitions of success." Clara looked around the workshop one last time, memorizing the organized chaos of tools and wood shavings, the smell of linseed oil and sawdust, a sense of timeless purpose that filled the space. Tomorrow she would return to glass towers and conference rooms, to the urgent demands of a world that measured value in quarterly returns and market share. But tonight, she stood in a carpenter's workshop, holding a wooden horse that would outlast them all, and she understood for the first time what it meant to create something that mattered, simply because it was made with love. The last night in Willow Creek stretched before them like a bridge between two different worlds, each hour bringing Clara closer to decisions that would reshape everything. She sat at Ben's kitchen table with her laptop open, making lists and arrangements with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned to function despite emotional turmoil. Flight confirmations, hospital transfers, executive assistant briefings, the infrastructure of departure spread across her screen like a blueprint for dismantling a life. Marco slept deeply on the couch, exhausted by a day of last adventures. And farewells that he was still too young to fully understand were permanent. His wooden horse sat on the coffee table beside him, the finish now dry and gleaming, every curve polished to perfection by Ben's patient hands. In sleep, Marco's face had lost the forced cheerfulness he'd maintained throughout the day, revealing the sadness he'd tried to hide for his mother's sake. Ben worked quietly in his shop, the soft sounds of final cleanup drifting through the summer air. Clara could see him through the window, moving with the same careful precision he brought to everything, restoring order to the space that had become Marco's introduction to the satisfaction of creating something with his own hands. There was something deeply melancholy about watching him work alone, returning the workshop to its solitary state after a week of shared purpose. Lily had cried at bedtime, the first real tears any of them had shed about the impending departure. She had begged Clara to let Marco stay just a little longer, offering her own bed, her toys, even her favorite stuffed rabbit if it would change the outcome. Ben had eventually carried her upstairs, his voice a gentle murmur as he explained that sometimes people had to leave even when everyone wanted them to stay. "It's like when the summer ends," Clara had heard him say through the ceiling. "You can't make it last longer just by wishing, but you can remember how beautiful it was and be grateful you got to experience it." Now the house held the peculiar quiet of a place suspended between one reality and another. Clara's phone sat silent on the table. She had turned off notifications hours ago, unable to bear the constant electronic intrusion of a world demanding her immediate return. Tomorrow would bring enough crisis management and damage control. Tonight belonged to the space between decisions, the liminal hours when anything still seemed possible, even as everything pointed toward inevitability. The back door opened softly, and Ben entered with the careful quiet of someone trying not to disturb the peace. His hands bore the familiar scent of wood and finishing oil, his hair slightly mussed from running his fingers through it, a gesture Clara had learned indicated deep thought or stress. "All finished?" she asked, nodding toward the workshop. "As finished as it needs to be." Ben poured himself a glass of water, his movements deliberately calm, despite the tension Clara could see in his shoulders. "How are the arrangements coming?" "Complicated, but manageable. There's a medical transport that can accommodate Marco's leg, flights that connect properly, a hospital in San Francisco that specializes in pediatric orthopedics." Clara's voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone reciting a checklist. "Everything will be handled professionally." "That's not what I meant." Clara looked up from her laptop, meeting Ben's eyes directly for the first time since her morning. Phone calls had shattered their fragile domestic peace. "What did you mean? How are you?" Not the logistics coordinator or the CEO, or even the concerned mother. "You, how are you handling all of this?" The question caught her off guard with its simplicity and directness. In her world, people asked how projects were progressing, how strategies were developing, how market positions were shifting. But no one asked how she was not really, not in a way that invited an honest answer rather than a professional status update. "I'm terrified," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could construct a more controlled response. "I'm terrified that I'm making the right choice for all the wrong reasons, or the wrong choice for all the right reasons. I'm terrified that I've given Marco a glimpse of something beautiful that I'm about to take away from him forever." Ben sat down across from her, his presence solid and reassuring in the lamplight. "And what are you terrified you're taking away?" "From yourself?" Clara closed her laptop with deliberate care, as if shutting away the digital demands could somehow create space for a more honest conversation. "The possibility that there's another way to live. That success doesn't have to be measured in market share, and quarterly growth. That may be, she paused, struggling with words that felt too large and dangerous to speak aloud. That maybe I've been so busy building something impressive that I forgot to build something meaningful. Those things don't have to be mutually exclusive, don't they? In my experience, meaning is a luxury you can afford after you've secured everything else. But security keeps moving further away, requiring more and more sacrifice to maintain. Ben was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving between Clara's face and the window where moonlight silvered the garden Sarah had planted years ago. Can I tell you something about security? Clara nodded. When Sarah got sick, I thought security meant having enough money for the best doctors, the newest treatments, whatever it took to keep her alive. I worked double shifts, took on projects I didn't want, missed time with her and Lily because I was convinced that financial resources would be the thing that saved us. Ben's voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully examined and slowly accepted. But cancer doesn't negotiate with bank balances. All that extra work, all that time I spent away from her, I can't get that back. And in the end, the most valuable thing I could give her wasn't money. It was presence. That's different. You are dealing with illness, with mortality. I'm dealing with business obligations, employee welfare. Are you? Or are you dealing with fear dressed up as responsibility? The words hit Clara like cold water, shocking in their directness. Fear of what? Fear that if you step off the treadmill, even for a moment, you'll discover that the life you've built doesn't actually need you as much as you think it does. Fear that if you choose happiness over achievement, people will think you're weak or uncommitted. Fear that if you let yourself want something different, you'll have to admit that the choices you've made up until now weren't the only ones available. Clara felt her chest tighten with recognition. And what if that's all true? What if I am weak for wanting to stay here, uncommitted for putting my personal feelings ahead of my professional obligations? Then you'd be human, which is not the same thing as weak. Through the ceiling came the soft sound of Lily stirring in her sleep, followed by Ben's gentle footsteps as he went to check on her. Clara sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable disorder of a life built on different principles than her own. The dish towels draped over chairs, the children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, the wooden bowl full of fruit from the Chung's garden. Everything spoke of interconnection, of value found in daily kindness rather than grand. Achievement. When Ben returned, he carried a small wooden box that Clara hadn't seen before. The wood was old, polished by decades of handling, with a simple brass clasp that had developed the green patina of age. This belonged to my father, Ben said, setting the box on the table between them, and his father before him. 3 generations of Carter men keeping their most important things in this box. What's in it? Ben opened the clasp with reverent care, revealing a collection of objects that seemed random until Clara began to understand their significance. A faded photograph of a young couple standing in front of a small house Ben's grandparents, she realized. A purple heart from his grandfather's military service. A letter, yellow with age, written in careful script. And nestled among these family treasures, a simple gold wedding band. My father's ring, Ben explained, lifting it carefully. He wore it for 43 years, until the day he died. My mother gave it to me, said I should save it for when I found someone worthy of the Carter family legacy. Clara stared at the ring, understanding the weight of what Ben was showing her, but not daring to assume its significance. It's beautiful. I put it on once, after Sarah died, just to see how it felt, but it didn't feel right. Sarah and I had our own rings, our own promises. This one belongs to a different kind of love story. Ben held the ring up to the lamplight, where it gleamed with the soft luster of well-maintained gold. I've been thinking about it a lot this week, about different kinds of love stories, and whether they all have to end the same way. Ben, I'm not asking you to marry me. Clara, we've known each other for 8 days, and half of those were spent dealing with crisis. But I am asking you to consider that there might be more than one way to write the ending to this story. Clara felt her heart racing, torn between hope and the practical voice that had guided her decisions for so many years. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe the choice isn't as binary as it seems. Maybe there's a third option that no one's considered, because it requires both of us to reimagine what our lives could look like. Such as, Ben set the ring back in its box, but left the box open between them like a question waiting for an answer. Such as you doing what you need to do to save your company, but not disappearing completely. Such as finding ways to be present for Marco that don't require you to abandon everything you've built. Such as discovering whether two people from different worlds can build something together without either of them having to give up who they are. That sounds impossibly complicated. Most worthwhile things do. Clara looked at the ring, at Ben's face, at the sleeping child visible through the doorway. Her son who had found something in this house that he'd never experienced in all. Their years of careful planning and achievement-focused living. The weight of decision pressed against her chest like a physical force. My phone has 47 unread messages, she said quietly. Investors, board members, clients who are questioning whether our company is stable enough to trust with their business. If I don't return tomorrow, prepared to give them absolute certainty about my commitment. Some of those relationships may be permanently damaged. And if you do return, if you throw yourself back into the world that demanded you choose between your injured child and your professional obligations, what gets permanently damaged then? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them wanted to fully examine. Clara thought about Marco's face when he'd shown her his first wooden carving, the pride and joy that had nothing to do with grades or achievements or preparation for some distant future success. She thought about Lily's innocent questions about poverty and wealth, and how a 6-year-old had understood something about true richness that Clara was only beginning to glimpse. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to balance a relationship with someone who lives in a completely different world. How to maintain a company while trying to be the kind of mother who makes pancakes and teaches patience and creates space for things that matter more than productivity. Nobody knows how to do it, Ben replied gently. That's why it's called figuring it out together. Outside, the night was beginning its slow progression toward dawn, marking the passage of hours that would soon require action rather than contemplation. Clara felt the pull of morning like gravity, dragging her toward decisions that would reshape not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who depended on her choices. If I asked you to come with us, she said suddenly, the words surprising them both with their emergence, would you consider it? Ben was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving around the kitchen that had been his anchor since Sarah's death. To San Francisco? To wherever we could build something that worked for both of us. You could set up a workshop, teach woodworking, maybe even go back to school for medicine, if that's something you still wanted. Marco would have the stability of consistent schooling in healthcare, but also the values you've taught him about creating beauty with his hands. And Lily? The question Clara had been avoiding, the complication that made every solution feel incomplete. Lily would have to leave everything she's ever known. Her friends, her school, the community that's been her anchor since her mother died. That's not a small thing to ask of a 6-year-old. No, it's not. Just like it's not a small thing to ask you to abandon the life you've built here, or for me to reorganize my entire company around a relationship that's existed for 8 days. Ben picked up his father's ring again, turning it slowly in the lamplight. You know what this ring represents? Not just love, but commitment to building something that lasts longer than the people who create it. My grandparents didn't know how to make their marriage work. They just decided they would, and then they figured it out day by day for 43 years. And you think we could do that? I think if we don't try, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been possible if we'd been brave enough to find out. Clara felt the truth of his words settle into her bones like warmth. Tomorrow would bring the plane that would carry her and Marco back to their old life, back to the carefully constructed world of achievement and advancement that had defined her adult years. But tonight, in this quiet kitchen, with a man who carved horses for children and kept his father's ring in a wooden box, she faced the possibility that there might be other ways to define success, other ways to build a life worth living. The choice, when it came down to it, was simple in its complexity: safety or possibility, the known path or the uncharted territory of two people deciding to trust each other with their futures. Reached across the table and touched the ring with one finger, feeling the smooth gold warm beneath her touch. "If we're going to do this," she said quietly, "we're going to need a plan." The morning arrived with the relentless brightness of a day that would not be denied, streaming through Ben's kitchen windows and illuminating the evidence of their sleepless night coffee cups scattered across the table, Clara's laptop surrounded by handwritten notes, and the wooden box still open with its precious contents catching the early light. They had talked until dawn, sketching possibilities and contingencies with the desperate energy of people trying to solve an equation with too many variables. Clara stood at the window, already dressed in the expensive clothes that marked her as belonging to a different world, her phone buzzing with the insistent demands of a corporate crisis that had been unfolding in her absence. But for the first time in days, she wasn't rushing to answer it. The plan they had developed in the quiet hours before sunrise required timing, required her to make one crucial decision before all the others fell into place. "The car will be here in 20 minutes, she said, her voice carrying the steady calm of someone who had moved beyond uncertainty into action. "Are you sure about this, Ben? Really sure? Because once we start down this path, there's no taking it back." Ben was helping Marco pack his few belongings, including the wooden horse that would travel with them as a tangible reminder of this week that had changed everything. His hands moved with their usual careful precision, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of a decision that would uproot not just his own life, but his daughter's. "I've never been sure of anything in my life," Ben replied quietly, "but I'm sure that I'd rather try and fail than spend the rest of my life wondering what we might have built together." From upstairs came the sound of Lily singing not the carefree songs of childhood, but something more subdued, the musical expression of a 6-year-old trying to process changes too large for her full understanding. She had taken the news of their departure with the resilience of children, but also with questions that revealed her deeper comprehension of what this meant for everyone she loved. "Is Daddy coming back?" she had asked the night before, and Clara had felt the full weight of what they were asking this child to accept on faith. Now, as the final preparations unfolded with the mechanical efficiency of a well-orchestrated plan, Clara found herself standing in Ben's living room, looking at the space that had sheltered them all. That had become the unlikely incubator for something none of them had expected to find. The worn couch where Marco had spent days healing, the kitchen table where she had learned to make unlumpy pancakes, the workshop visible through the window where her son had discovered the satisfaction of creating beauty with his own hands. Marco appeared at her side, moving carefully on his crutches, but with obvious pride in his improved mobility. "I'm ready," he announced, though his voice carried the weight of someone who understood that ready and willing were not always the same thing. "How do you feel about all of this, sweetheart?" Clara asked, crouching to his level for one of their increasingly precious private conversations. "About leaving here? About the changes we're going to try to make?" Marco considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. "I'm sad to leave Lily and Ben, but excited that maybe we'll all be together again soon. I'm nervous about Dad's reaction, but I think maybe he'll understand when he sees how happy we've been here. And if he doesn't understand, then that's his choice," Marco replied with startling maturity. You taught me that we can't control other people's reactions, only our own decisions. I think we're making a good decision." The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of their transportation. Not the sleek corporate car Clara might have chosen in her old life, but a practical vehicle that could accommodate Marco's limited mobility and their accumulated belongings. Through the window, Clara could see the driver checking his paperwork, preparing for the journey that would carry them back toward their previous world, but along a completely different trajectory. "Time to go," Ben said softly, appearing with Lily at his side. The little girl's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she held herself with the dignity of someone who had learned that goodbyes were part of life's rhythm, even when they felt like endings. The next few minutes unfolded with the surreal quality of a dream, where familiar actions carried unfamiliar weight. Luggage loaded into the vehicle, careful attention to Marco's comfort and safety, final checks of forgotten items and last-minute necessities. But underneath the practical choreography, Clara felt the electric tension of a moment that would define everything that came after. Ben walked them to the car, his hand resting lightly on Marco's shoulder, in a gesture that had become natural over their week together. At the vehicle's open door, he paused, his eyes meeting Clara's with an intensity that communicated everything they hadn't had time to say properly. 6 weeks, Clara said quietly, the timeline they had agreed upon after hours of careful calculation. "I'll have everything arranged by then," the company stabilized. The logistics worked out, the difficult conversations completed. 6 weeks, Ben confirmed, though Clara could hear the question hidden in his agreement. 6 weeks felt simultaneously like a lifetime, and no time at all enough to reorganize two completely different lives, but hardly enough to test whether their dawn planning could survive contact with the reality of implementation. Lily stepped forward then, reaching up to hug Clara with the fierce intensity of childhood affection. "You have to come back," she whispered against Clara's shoulder. "You promised you'd teach me more about not making lumpy pancakes." "I'll come back," Clara promised, though the words felt enormous in their implications. "And you have to keep practicing your woodworking so you can show me what you've learned." The embrace with Ben lasted longer, neither of them willing to be the first to step away from the connection that had become their anchor point in a week of chaos and possibility. When they finally separated, Clara could see reflected in his eyes the same mixture of hope and terror that she felt in her own chest. "Don't let them change your mind," Ben said quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. "Whatever pressure they put on you, whatever arguments they make about responsibility and practical considerations, remember that choosing happiness isn't selfish. It's brave." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to respond. Instead, she settled into the car beside Marco, who was clutching his wooden horse like a talisman, and watched through the window as Ben and Lily grew smaller in the distance. The drive to the airport passed in contemplative silence, broken only by Marco's occasional comments about the landscape and his observations about the differences between their week in Willow Creek and their normal life in San Francisco. Clara found herself studying her son's profile, noting the peace in his expression despite the uncertainty of their situation, the confidence that had replaced the anxious perfectionism that had characterized his behavior before the accident. At the airport, the transition back to their familiar world began immediately. Special assistance for Marco's mobility needs, first-class accommodations that emphasized their economic privileges, the efficient impersonality of modern travel that wrapped them in comfortable anonymity. But Clara found herself missing the personal attention of small-town life, the way everyone in Willow Creek had known their names and their story. As their plane lifted off, carrying them back toward the city that held their previous life, Clara pulled out her phone and began the series of calls that would set their plan in motion. The first call was the hardest to David, her business partner, who answered with the relieved desperation of someone who had been fighting a losing battle alone. "Clara, thank God. Please tell me you're on your way back and ready to save what's left of our company. I'm on my way back, Clara confirmed, watching the landscape shrink below them into abstract patterns of agriculture and development. And yes, I'm ready to save the company. But David, we need to talk about some changes. Big ones. What kind of changes? Clara looked at Marco, who was absorbed in examining his wooden horse in the airplane's artificial light, finding new details in the grain patterns that Ben's craftsmanship had revealed. The kind that redefine what saving the company actually means. The kind that make it worth saving for reasons beyond just market share and profit margins. The conversation that followed would be the first of many difficult discussions over the coming weeks. Each one a step toward building something that had never existed before, a life that honored both achievement and meaning, success and happiness, professional responsibility and personal connection. As the plane carried them toward an uncertain future, Clara felt the weight of the choice she had made settling into her bones like a new kind of gravity. There would be no going back now, no return to the careful boundaries that had defined her previous existence. She had chosen possibility over safety, love over control, and the terrifying freedom of writing her own story rather than following the script that others had written for successful women in her position. 6 weeks later, Clara stood in the conference room of Rivera Technologies, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a company in transition. Charts and projections covered the walls. Laptops hummed with the quiet efficiency of teams working at full capacity, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco spread out below like a circuit board of ambition and possibility. But for all the familiar trappings of corporate success, something fundamental had changed in the way Clara approached the work that had once consumed her entirely. The restructuring is ahead of schedule, David reported, his voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested he still couldn't quite believe they had pulled it off. The remote work initiative has actually increased productivity by 15%, and the satellite office concept is generating interest from 3 other major markets. Clara nodded, though her attention was partially focused on the framed photograph that now sat on her desk. Ben's workshop, with Lily and Marco bent over their woodworking projects, captured in a moment of concentrated creativity. The image served as both reminder and anchor, a visual representation of the values she was trying to integrate into her professional world. "What about the Portland location?" she asked, referring to the expansion that would eventually bridge the geographical gap between her business and the life she was building with Ben. Site selected, lease negotiations in progress. The local talent pool is impressive, and the cost savings compared to Bay Area operations are substantial. David paused, studying Clara's face with the careful attention of someone who had watched his business partner undergo a fundamental transformation over the past month and a half. "You know, when you first proposed this distributed model, I thought you were having some kind of breakdown. But the numbers don't lie. This is actually making us stronger." Clara smiled, recognizing the truth in his observation. The crisis that had threatened to destroy her company had instead forced an evolution that made it more resilient, more innovative, more aligned with the changing nature of work itself. By refusing to choose between personal happiness and professional success, she had accidentally discovered a third option that enhanced both. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ben. "Lily lost another tooth. She's insisting on saving it for when you get here. Says you need to see the tooth fairy economics in action." The message brought a smile that felt different from the controlled expressions she had worn in boardrooms for years, softer, more genuine, rooted in connection rather than strategy. Around the conference table, her colleagues had grown accustomed to these moments when their CEO's attention briefly shifted to a world beyond quarterly projections and market analysis. "The integration timeline remains on track?" Clara asked, returning her focus to the meeting while typing a quick response about tooth fairy exchange rates. "Better than on track. The team is excited about the hybrid model, and frankly, morale has never been higher." There's something to be said for a leadership approach that acknowledges people have lives outside of work. The irony wasn't lost on Clara. By learning to balance her own life, she had inadvertently created a company culture that attracted and retained talent more effectively than any traditional benefits package. The personal had become professional in ways she never could have anticipated. As the meeting concluded and her colleagues dispersed to their various projects, Clara remained at the conference table, looking out at the city that had shaped her ambitions for so many years. In 3 days, she would board a plane not for a business trip or crisis management, but for the most important journey of her adult life, the return to Willow Creek that would determine whether the future she and Ben had imagined could become reality. The past 6 weeks had been a masterclass in controlled transformation. Difficult conversations with Marco's father, who had initially threatened legal action, before gradually accepting that his son was thriving under arrangements that defied conventional wisdom. Delicate negotiations with investors, who questioned whether a CEO could maintain proper focus while playing house with a small-town carpenter. As one particularly dismissive board member had put it, but the most challenging work had been internal learning. To trust that choosing happiness wouldn't automatically result in professional disaster. That integrating different parts of herself might actually make her more effective rather than less focused. The woman who had once measured success entirely in market share and profit margins was discovering that leadership could be enhanced by understanding what actually mattered in life. Her assistant knocked on the conference room door, holding a package that bore the unmistakable return address of Willow Creek. Clara's heart skipped as she recognized Ben's careful handwriting, and she found herself smiling before she even opened the box. Inside, nestled in wood shavings that still carried the scent of his workshop, was a small carved bird, clearly Lily's work, but guided by Ben's patient instruction. The craftsmanship was imperfect but proud, each cut revealing the determination of small hands, learning to shape raw material into beauty. A note in Lily's careful printing accompanied the gift. For your office, so you remember we're making things while you're making business. Clara placed the wooden bird on her desk beside the photograph, creating a small shrine to the life she was building beyond these glass walls. The contrast was striking. The sleek technology and minimalist design of her corporate environment surrounding these tangible reminders of a world where value was measured in patience, craftsmanship, and the satisfaction of creating something that would last. That evening, alone in her luxury apartment with its panoramic views and designer furnishings, Clara found herself packing with the careful attention of someone preparing for permanent relocation rather than an extended visit. Each item she selected carried significance: clothes that would work for both corporate video conferences and small-town community events, books that could travel between worlds, the few pieces of jewelry that held meaning beyond their monetary value. Marco emerged from his room carrying a duffel bag that seemed impossibly small for a cross-country move. His leg had healed completely, the cast replaced by confidence and the kind of resilience that came from surviving unexpected challenges. But more than his physical recovery, Clara marveled at the emotional growth she had witnessed. Her son had discovered interests and friendships that existed independent of academic achievement, had learned that there were different kinds of intelligence and success. Ready for the adventure? She asked, using the phrase they had adopted to describe their leap into an unknown future. Ready, Marco confirmed, though his voice carried the weight of someone who understood that adventures involved both excitement and risk. Mom, what if it doesn't work? What if living together is different from visiting, and Ben decides he doesn't want the complications we bring to his life? Clara sat beside her son on the couch, noting how their expensive apartment suddenly felt like a stage set, beautiful, but somehow artificial compared to the lived-in comfort of Ben's modest house. Then we'll figure out something else, she replied honestly. But Marco, what if it does work? What if we're brave enough to build something new and beautiful together? Like the wooden horse? Exactly like the wooden horse. something that starts as raw material and becomes something meaningful through patience and care and the willingness to trust the process. As they settled into their final night in San Francisco, Clara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this threshold. 6 weeks ago, she had been a successful but increasingly isolated executive, raising her son in the protective bubble of economic privilege while missing the deeper satisfactions that made privilege worth having. Now she was preparing to relocate her life around the radical notion that love and work could coexist, that professional success could be redefined to include personal happiness. The phone rang. Near midnight, Ben's voice, carrying the familiar warmth that had become her anchor through weeks of difficult transitions. "How are the final preparations going?" "Terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure," Clara replied, curling up in the chair that faced the city lights. "Tell me again that we're not completely insane for attempting this." "We're not completely insane," Ben assured her, though she could hear the smile in his voice. "We're just two people who decided that building something together was worth the risk of failure." "And Lily? How is she handling the anticipation?" "She's been rearranging her room for the 3rd time this week, trying to figure out how to make space for Marco's things while keeping her own treasures accessible. This morning, she announced that she's going to teach you advanced woodworking techniques she learned while you were gone." Clara laughed, imagining the serious concentration Lily brought to all her creative projects. "I look forward to my advanced training. What about you? Any second thoughts about taking on a ready-made family with complicated logistics and a mother who's still learning how to balance competing priorities?" "Every day," Ben replied honestly. "But then I remember how it felt to have voices in my house again, to share meals and projects, and the daily satisfactions of building something together. I remember how Lily lit up when she had someone to teach, how Marco discovered that he could create beauty with his hands. Second thoughts don't seem very important compared to the possibility of making that permanent." They talked until Clara's phone battery began to die, discussing practical details and sharing the kind of intimate observations that had become possible only after they had committed to building a future together. When they finally said goodnight, Clara felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and terror that had characterized her emotional state for weeks. Tomorrow would bring the flight that carried them toward an entirely new definition of home. Not just a geographical relocation, but a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to live successfully, to raise a child, to love someone whose world operated by different rules than her own. As Clara finally settled into sleep in her expensive apartment, for the last time she found herself thinking about the wooden bird Lily had carved for her office. Imperfect but proud, created through patience and guidance, shaped by small hands learning to trust their own ability to create beauty from raw material. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor for the life they were all learning to build together. 1 year later, Clara stood in the doorway of what had once been Ben's solitary workshop, watching her blended family work together on their latest project, a dining table large enough to accommodate the life they had built from equal parts hope and determination. The space had evolved over the months to reflect their combined needs. Ben's traditional hand tools sharing wall space with Marco's more modern equipment. Lily's small workbench positioned where she could observe and learn. And Clara's laptop station tucked into a corner where she could manage conference calls while remaining part of the creative process. "The mortise needs to be just a hair deeper," Ben was explaining to Marco, who bent over the joint with the focused concentration he had learned to apply to both mathematics and woodworking. "Feel how the tenon fits there should be resistance, but not force." Lily, now 7 and considerably more confident in her abilities, was sanding table legs with the methodical patience she had inherited from her father. Her technique had improved dramatically over the past year, though she still favored projects involving animals. A menagerie of wooden creatures had colonized various surfaces throughout the house, each one displaying her growing skill and unwavering enthusiasm for giving everything she created a distinct personality. "Mom, can you check my email server connection?" Marco called from his position at the workbench. At 13, he had become the family's unofficial IT specialist, managing the technical infrastructure that allowed Clara to work remotely while maintaining her presence in their daily lives. "I'm trying to upload the photos of our project for the online portfolio, but the connection seems slow." Clara smiled at the casual way her son balanced digital competence with traditional craftsmanship, moving seamlessly between worlds that had once seemed incompatible. She checked his laptop settings while simultaneously monitoring her own screen, where a video conference with her Portland team was wrapping up with the efficient satisfaction of a well-managed company operating across multiple time zones. "The satellite office integration is ahead of schedule," David reported from his position in the San Francisco headquarters, his image slightly pixelated, but his voice clear through the workshop's upgraded internet connection. "Employee satisfaction scores are through the roof, and we're getting inquiries from other companies interested in implementing similar distributed models." "Excellent. What about the renewable energy portfolio?" 3 new contracts signed this week, and the Morrison acquisition is finally paying dividends. Turns out taking time to make thoughtful decisions rather than rushing into reactive strategies actually improves long-term outcomes. Who would have thought? Clara caught Ben's eye across the workshop, sharing the private amusement of people who had learned that conventional wisdom wasn't always wise. The crisis that had once threatened to destroy her company had instead forced an evolution that made it stronger, more innovative, more aligned with both market trends and human values. "Wrap up the Portland logistics, and we'll reconvene Monday," Clara concluded, closing her laptop as the video conference ended. "Marco, your connection is fine. The upload might be slow because half the town is probably streaming something. Rural internet has its limitations." "Unlike rural craftsmanship," Ben added, running his hand along the table's smooth surface with obvious satisfaction. "This piece is going to outlast all our technology by several decades." The observation had become a family joke over the past year. Ben's gentle teasing about their dependence on devices, Clara and Marco's good-natured, ribbing about his preference for tools that hadn't changed in centuries. But underneath the humor lay a deeper appreciation for the different kinds of intelligence they each brought to their shared life. Afternoon brought a stream of visitors that would have been overwhelming in Clara's previous life, but had become the comfortable rhythm of small-town existence. Margaret Chun stopped by with vegetables from her garden and an update on Tom's recovery from his latest gardening mishap. The Henderson family arrived with their children for what had become a weekly tradition of combined family dinners and collaborative projects. Joe Kowalski delivered a special order of wood stain, along with the latest gossip about the seasonal. Tourists who brought both commerce and mild chaos to Willow Creek each summer. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Margaret observed, watching Clara help Lily apply finish to a small jewelry box they had been working on together. "Seems like yesterday you were strangers stranded by a storm, and now look at you fixtures of the community." Clara paused in her work, considering the transformation that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had once measured success entirely in financial metrics now found equal satisfaction in the completion of a handcrafted piece of furniture. In her daughters, she had begun thinking of Lily that way months ago, mastery of a new woodworking technique in the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with neighbors who had become family. "Sometimes the best changes are the ones you never planned," she replied, noting how naturally the words came now. A year ago, such sentiment would have felt foreign on her tongue, a betrayal of the goal-oriented mindset that had driven her professional success. Now it felt like wisdom earned through experience. The evening brought their weekly video call with Marco's father, a ritual that had evolved from tense negotiations about custody and visitation to genuine conversations about their sons' development and happiness. Richard's initial opposition to the unconventional living arrangement, had gradually softened as he witnessed Marco's growth, not just academically, where he continued to excel, but in confidence, creativity, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from learning to work with his hands as well as his mind. The mathematics competition results came in. Richard reported from his London office, his voice carrying the pride he had learned to express more freely over the past year. Marco placed second in the regional finals. Remarkable work, especially considering his diverse educational environment. He had excellent teachers, Clara replied diplomatically, though she caught Ben's amused expression at Richard's careful phrasing. Their son's education now included traditional academics supplemented by woodworking, community service, and the kind of practical life skills that came from being part of a family that functioned as both unit and workshop. And the wooden clock he sent me is quite impressive, Richard continued, his tone suggesting surprise at his own appreciation for craftsmanship. I've placed it in my office. Colleagues have been asking where I acquired such unique work. After the call ended, the family settled into their evening routine homework completed at the kitchen table Ben had made during their second month together. Stories read in the living room that now bore the comfortable disorder of a space shared by four people with different interests and projects, and the quiet satisfaction of a day well lived, measured in small accomplishments and shared experiences. Mom, Lily said as Clara tucked her into bed, remember when you didn't know how to make pancakes that weren't lumpy? Clara laughed, remembering the anxiety she had felt during those first awkward days when everything about domestic life seemed foreign and slightly overwhelming. I remember. You were a very patient teacher. Now you make the best pancakes in the whole world. Well, except for Daddy's, but his are different best. Different how? Lily considered this with the philosophical seriousness she brought to all important questions. Daddy's pancakes taste like home and Sundays and being safe. Your pancakes taste like adventure and trying new things and being brave enough to learn. The observation hit Clara with unexpected force, the recognition that even something as simple as breakfast could carry the flavors of personal growth and transformation. What do you think our pancakes taste like when we make them together? Like family, Lily replied without hesitation. Like the best kind of family, where everyone teaches everyone else things and nobody has to be perfect all the time. Later, as Clara and Ben sat together on the front porch watching stars emerge in the clear country sky, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this peaceful evening. The crisis that had once threatened to tear apart everything she had built had instead revealed the possibility of building something entirely different. Life that honored both achievement and connection, success and happiness, individual growth and collective support. Any regrets? Ben asked, his voice carrying the comfortable intimacy of people who had learned to share their uncertainties as well as their joys. Daily, Clara replied honestly. But not about the big decision. About smaller things times when I prioritize. A conference call over Lily's school presentation. Or when I get impatient with Marco's perfectionism because it reminds me too much of my own. Learning to balance competing demands is harder than I expected. But worth it? Clara looked through the window at the house that had become their home, where evidence of their blended life filled every room. Marco's advanced textbooks sharing shelf space with Lily's picture books. Business documents mixed with woodworking. Plans. The comfortable chaos of a family that had learned to function as both sanctuary and workshop. Worth everything, she confirmed. Even the difficult parts. Especially the difficult parts. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of a town that had accepted them as permanent residents rather than temporary visitors. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, client meetings, conducted via video conference, school activities that required careful coordination, the ongoing work of building a relationship that spanned different worlds and different definitions of success. But tonight, surrounded by the tangible evidence of what they had created together, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that came from choosing possibility over safety, love over control, and the messy, beautiful reality of building something new rather than maintaining something familiar. On the coffee table inside, the wooden horse Ben had carved for Marco during their first week together caught the lamplight, its surface worn smooth by a year of handling. Beside it sat the jewelry box Lily and Clara had finished that afternoon, its simple lines hiding the complex joints that represented hours of patient learning and collaboration. These objects, created with love and intended to last, seemed to Clara like perfect metaphors for the life they had built, imperfect but sturdy, beautiful in its functionality, crafted from raw material and shaped by the patient application of skill, wisdom, and the revolutionary belief that happiness was not a luxury to be deferred, but a foundation upon which everything else could be built. As they finally went inside, turning off lights and checking locks in the domestic ritual that marked the end of another day, Clara caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her carried traces of the executive she had been, the confidence, the intelligence, the determination that had built a successful company from nothing. But overlaying those familiar features was something new, the peace that came from living an integrated life where professional achievement and personal satisfaction enhanced rather than competed with each other. In the morning, she would wake to coffee made by Ben's patient hands, to Lily's cheerful chatter about the day's planned adventures, to Marco's quiet focus as he prepared for whatever challenges awaited him. She would manage conference calls and review financial projections and make decisions that affected the lives of employees across multiple states. But she would do all of this from a foundation of love and connection that made both the work and the rest more meaningful. As she settled into sleep beside Ben, Clara felt the deep gratitude that came from understanding how close she had come to missing all of this, how easily she might have chosen the familiar path of professional achievement at the expense of personal happiness, never discovering that the choice itself had been false. Some storms, she had learned, didn't just pass over. Some storms brought gifts wrapped in chaos and pain, gifts that revealed possibilities that could only be seen from the other side of courage. Outside, Willow Creek settled into its nightly quiet, holding this family and all the others in the gentle embrace of a community that understood that the best things in life, love, security, the satisfaction of meaningful work, were built slowly, with patience and care, one day at a time.